Okay, so the one thing I just need to point out to you, which I think some of you noticed, is with the psych module this year for the module code 5121, which you guys did at the end of last semester, they have changed the textbook for this year. But you guys will still use exactly the same textbook you used last year. But when they did the module outline, I think they're using a reference in terms of chapter numbers to the new textbook. So what I've done is I have put last year's 5122 module outline up under more resources. So please, I think, use that module outline to guide you, because it has page number references, which does make it easier for you. So what I've done is when I've put the module or the outline for this particular learning unit up, I have used the guide from last year's second semester module, which is under your more resources, and that means that your chapters they match in terms of chapter numbering, and the page referencing will match. So if that's all okay with you, it is under more resources, and I would suggest you use that that module outline just to guide you so that you can keep on track. Not that there's anything different between the two textbooks significantly. The new textbook has got some more South African examples in. There's a few things taken out, a few things added in, but there's absolutely no change in your content. Your content remains exactly the same. The topics remain exactly the same. The learning outcomes remain the same. It's just maybe it's easier to follow the previous module outline just so those page number references are correct. And I have pointed it out to Varsity College, and they said just to use your old textbook and this particular guide. So hopefully that's all okay. All right, can you all hear me? Because no one's saying anything. Are we all good? Perfect. All right, let's just hop back to the first page. So this module, your first module of this semester, is on human development, or we can also call it development psychology, and it's chapter 11 in your textbook. All right, so that's where we're heading. The module outline, or the learning unit outline for this, we move through 5 different themes, and it's really interesting. If you've got children, you'll find it interesting. If you've got older children, you'll find it interesting. If you fit into any of these phases, which obviously do, you'll find it interesting. So it's a good chapter. It's a good chapter, and it covers development really well, from sort of preconception right the way through until death, but with a focus primarily on childhood, which is sort of the biggest, is the area where development happens the quickest and has the biggest impact on the future development of children into adults and adulthood. So the themes we cover is really the prenatal stage, which is before birth. And I've put arrows there because then it indicates that when you look at your book, the specific learning outcomes that you need for this module. So for example, you need to be able to outline the major events of the 3 stages of prenatal development. You need to be able to identify some of the influences on prenatal development, and there's your page numbers. So even though it gives you page numbers and it refers you to certain areas, you still do need to cover the entire chapter of the textbook, because that's how the concept of development and development psychology can be fully understood. So we do the prenatal phase. We look at, in childhood, we look at how motor skills develop, language and social emotional development takes place. We look at how personality and cognitive development takes place in childhood. We then look at moving from childhood into adolescence, and then we look at adulthood. So those are the different phases that we move through in terms of this particular learning unit. So hopefully that's all clear, and your guide is there for you to look at. Right, so let's get going, and let's firstly talk about what development means and what it means to develop. So if we think about a child growing through childhood into adolescence and adulthood, what we're really looking at is we're looking at the changes in behavior and all things associated with behavior that basically correlate or link with growth and maturation of that child into adulthood. So we know that development, it starts in the womb, and it's lifelong. It goes on as long as the person is living and breathing. There is development taking place. Sometimes it's mainly positive development, but as you get older, when some of your gray matter, your gray cells start to disintegrate, development is actually not a positive outcome. There's a few negative things that link in there too into late adulthood. But basically, it's very much age-related changes that happen sequentially. From the time that we are conceived up until the time we die, there's a series of changes that take place. So it's a lifelong process, and that's why we look at the complete expanse of a lifespan in terms of development. So primarily when we look at development, we look at it in different areas. We look at it as physical development, which includes things like motor skills and psychophysiological processes. That's the processes that our biological systems develop and cause changes in behavior. So physical development, we look at cognitive development, which speaks to language, it speaks to problem solving, it speaks to understanding. And we also speak to social and emotional development, which is personality, how identities are formed, and how we think of ourselves, our own self-concept. So within each of those phases of our life and our life journey, within each phase, there's different areas where development is focused on and changes can take place. So with development psychology and development psychologists, we look at the way change occurs. So there are many dominant models around development, and you'll see the theorists as we work through the material. So there's stage theories that we develop in a certain way, and then that stage ends and we move into the next stage and we move into the next stage. So there are people who have the stage theory approach to development. And what causes the change, it's basically, it can be an interplay. It's very much an interactionist approach between biological and environmental factors. And we see that, when we say that there's an interaction between biological and environmental factors, if we look at it sort of in an environment where there is poverty and children living in poverty, where you have mothers who maybe are pregnant, don't have the right nutrition, don't have have environmental influences that cause damage to their unborn child. Children grow up in poverty, they're not stimulated. They end up having low academic achievements, they have behavioral issues, and they go on to sort of become mothers themselves, and again give rise to children who also have behavioral issues or certain development deficits. So when there are problems in that whole cycle of development, then the cycle, it becomes embedded in our culture. It's very hard to break. So that's why I say when we look at an interactionist approach, when we look at the interplay between the biological and environmental factors with development, it's important to consider the whole picture in which a child is raised, both from an environmental point of view as well as from a biological point of view as they move through the life cycle. So that's just a little overview of how the development process works in terms of interplay. So we start the module really looking at the very first prenatal stage, and we call it almost like there's a stage called the first 1,000 days, and development happens from the minute that conception occurs. Is where things start to take place, mainly biological development at this point in the prenatal phase. But a very big influence is the environmental factors on prenatal development, and we'll cover that shortly. So the prenatal development stage is up until the child is born. And it starts at conception, where you have the first 2 weeks is called the little germinal phase, where the sperm and the egg fuse together and then they implant to the uterine wall. And so for 2 weeks, that phase is a germinal phase. It's a little blob with cells and it's implanted on the uterine wall. Development then starts to take place, biological, physical development, where in the embryonic phase, which is slightly longer, up until the first 2 months, the basic organs of the body start to form, and that's where your baby becomes viable. If it lasts longer than sort of 3 months, if you can keep a baby longer than 3 months, then you've got a really viable pregnancy. And your final stage is your fetal stage, which lasts 7 months. So at the end of week 24 in a pregnancy, if a baby is born prematurely, it can survive on its own. But ideally, it does need to go to term for the full 9 months. So that's our very first step of development, and when and how development actually starts to take place in the prenatal phase. But during that phase, it's really important, and this is the nature starting to impact, or the nurture starting to impact, the environment starting to impact on the development of the child. And there are some really significant influences on prenatal development that can really harm and affect the baby physically and mentally. So it's a very important phase of the lifespan, is to understand what these risks are in the prenatal phase. So some of the risks that we can look at or consider when we look at situations is we look at genetic factors. So that's like the heritability of what has happened with things like gene abnormalities, where faulty genes are transferred, which can lead to physical deficiencies in the child. You have chromosome abnormalities, where there could be irregular sections of the DNA which cause Down syndrome. But that's also, it can be very hereditary, and that's why older mothers certainly go for testing to have a look at, to see whether any of these abnormalities are existing in the child in this prenatal phase. So often an older mother will go for tests to see if their baby could possibly be suffering from Down syndrome, and some of these abnormalities can still be picked up early on, in sort of when the child is still in the womb, still in vitro. Maternal nutrition is a very big impactor on prenatal development. So it's really important that a mother has the correct nutrients, the vitamins, things like folic acid, to promote optimal growth. But it's not just the nutrients, they've also got to have sufficient calories as well, because they have to feed themselves and they have to feed the child. So for optimal development of a child, an unborn child, there has to be nutritional well-being in the terms of nutrients, vitamins, and calories. Maternal stress and emotion has a very big impact on unborn children. It can disrupt the hormones and the hormone balance that leads to a healthy development. If the mother suffers from severe maternal stress, it can lead to a child being born with hyperactivity, maybe a decreased immune system, a low birth rate and other complications. So it's important that the stresses on the mother are reduced, but we also know that now we experience more stresses. So pregnant mothers are not immune to stress. It just means stress has to be managed in order to keep the baby safe and healthy. Another issue with unborn children is the use of drugs. And this is not just, when we think of drugs, not just thinking of marijuana and drugs like that, it's even over-the-counter medication. So if people take the wrong medication or too much of a certain medication, it can impact on an unborn child. Alcohol, if a mother drinks during pregnancy, there's a very good chance, depending on how much they drink, the child could actually be born with what's called fetal alcohol syndrome, which is where they have mental and physical, both of those deficiencies. Smoking during pregnancy can lead to lower birth weights and also have long-term consequences on the child's cognition, possibly bringing on ADHD and even antisocial behavior. And other substances like marijuana and cocaine is that if a child is in the womb and the mother is a user of such stimulants and such substances, the child itself, even in the womb, can develop addictions. And when the child is born, the child can exhibit symptoms of withdrawal. So that is why it's really important that mothers must not use drugs such as that can actually have significant impact. And also maternal illnesses and psychopathology. So infectious diseases such as HIV/AIDS can affect unborn children. Different cultures also have an effect on children in the womb, the influence of culture and family, how things within the culture, such as ancestors and spirits, can cause problems with unborn children. If people are single parents, maybe they are under more stress than people who are happily married. Poverty can cause problems, maternal depression can cause problems, and even environmental toxins such as air pollution, radioactivity, and some pesticides can harm unborn children. So those are important things to understand, because that obviously the first few months of life is the minute conception takes place until birth, and the child is very vulnerable in that position. So it's really important that mothers understand what those elements are that can cause harm to unborn children. All right, so that's our prenatal development. So now we move into childhood, which is really from birth up through until sort of teenagerhood, but we focus mainly on sort of in these slides, sort of this early years, sort of 0 to 5, I suppose, 0 to 6, 0 to 9. It's where there's rapid development. It happens very quickly. If you look at children from the time they're born until the time they sort of start school, there's huge amounts of development that take place in all areas of development. So the first thing we look at is we look at the importance of motor development. And when we talk about motor development, that is your movement and your physical skills. So a baby starts to crawl, and that's its first sign of significant motor development, is crawling. But its early mobility is very much hampered by the proportions. Its head is much bigger than its body, so it has to wait for its growth proportions to match out, and then crawling and walking can start to happen. And we'll cover it in this next slide, but there's a genetic blueprint really for development. Development happens pretty sequentially in a certain order within certain time frames. So it's almost like there is a blueprint for that. And we have developmental norms where children can fit into that blueprint. Children grow really from head to toe, and they also grow from the midline outwards. Our milestones can be driven by biology, and we respond sometimes to experience with those milestones, but it's mainly biologically driven. And once an infant starts to develop and parts of the nervous system develop and mature, new skills can develop very rapidly, and we see that with young children. And again, in motor development, there are cultural variations where some cultures specifically limit the child in terms of its ability to explore and learn the world for itself. They sort of keep the child close to them with little contact with anything that could actually cause a problem. But instead of the child learning through exploring, it's very much limited by the environment that it is maintained or kept in. Okay, so the basic principles that are apparent in motor development, basically the children begin to gain control over the upper part of their body before the lower part of their body. So you see arm movement and head movement, and that's why the crawling mainly uses the arms. Children drag themselves forward, and then the lower part of the body follows. And again, children gain control over their torsos and their body before they do with their extremities. So those are the two sort of physical development trends. But it's all part of maturation. Okay, so as they gradually unfold, as the blueprint unfolds, as children grow, they start to mature, and so development takes place from a physical perspective. So if we look at what we spoke about, the blueprint, you have what's called developmental milestones. And we look at things like gross motor development, which is their ability to walk and kick a ball. We look at fine motor development, which is things like picking up a pen or picking up something off the floor, their personal social development, their language development, and their cognitive development. And at certain ages, there are certain things that a child should be able to do. And that's what we use to measure the progress of children, to see if they're within those developmental norms or whether there's some kind of developmental issue or a developmental delay that needs to be addressed. So when children are at school, when they're at preschool, those kind of developmental milestones are monitored, and if there's something that's proving to be not quite in line with the developmental milestone, a referral might be made to an OT or an educational psychologist or something. So that's what we mean by developmental milestones. They're quite broad, so people mustn't panic if their children aren't walking by the age of or kicking a ball or walking up and down stairs by the age of 2, it may be 2.5. So there is some variation in that, but there's a general blueprint there that we follow to see whether children are actually developing appropriately at the right age. Temperament, again, is also something that happens with young children. A temperament is basically the mood or the emotional reactivity of a child. And there's 3 types of temperament. There's an easy temperament. So some people might have a newborn baby up until about 18 months, and they might say, oh, my baby was so easy to cope with. He slept all the time. He didn't cry. He wasn't fussy. An easy temperament. Some children are slower to warm up, and other children actually have a very difficult temperament. You might get a baby who cries all the time, doesn't settle, niggles, fusses. And so, children are born with these different temperaments, and these temperaments can have an ongoing impact on later personality development because they are generally stable, relatively stable temperaments. But often the temperaments, they're not always just one or the other. There's obviously sometimes a mix between the two. So we often might see when we come to look at some of the when we look at abnormal behavior and we might look at some of those mental illnesses, one of the things could be what was the temperament of the child when they were younger? Were they a very difficult child? Were they niggly and hard to settle, or were they easy? So there can be an impact later on in personality development and mental illness if the temperament was significantly compromised when they were young. So that's what temperament means. So when we have a small child, we have what's called emotional development and we have attachment. So attachment really it's the bonding that happens between that newborn child or infant to its primary caregiver. And in most cases, the primary caregiver is the mother. If the mother is maybe the mother is not around anymore, it could be the father or another relative, but primarily it is the mother that the child forms that very first emotional bond with. And a key factor in developing attachment is mobility, which happens in the second half of the first year. And you see attachment and attachment issues, you really start to see where they're significant is when a stranger comes into a situation and is there a reaction to that stranger. So in the first 6 to 8 months is where the attachment starts to develop, and often there'll be a separation anxiety. When the mother leaves, the child will experience emotional distress. Emotional distress, people being separated from people who they formed an attachment with. So if I say to you, will you look after my baby, and I hand it over to you and I walk away, there's a very good chance the child will start crying because it would have formed an attachment to me, and that starts to happen in the first 6 to 8 months. So we have 1 or 2 predominant theorists in this in the concept of attachment and children. And again, when we talk about attachment, any sort of dysregularity in these attachment processes in early childhood can lead to deficits in personalities in later life. So it's important when we look at children and we look at their attachment and their attachment styles to parents and that kind of thing. Parenting is very important when it comes to attachment. So Bowlby introduced a theory of attachment, and he basically said that attachment of a child to its primary caregiver it's an evolutionary process. It's important for survival. And so the child automatically tries to keep people close to it through behaviors such as smiling and cooing and clinging, because that triggers affection and that also creates protection. So his theory of attachment was that it's very much biological. It's an innate process. We're born with it, and it's to preserve ourselves. For the child, it's about a safety issue, which then ensures survival. Is let me get people attracted to me, they'll protect me, they'll look after me, and therefore I will survive. Mary Ainsworth she went on to investigate what was called the quality of the attachment. So although all children have an attachment to their primary caregiver, that attachment can vary in quality. So you get attachment styles. She identified attachment styles such as a secure attachment. So a child has a very secure attachment to its primary caregiver. So basically what that means is that the caregiver would comfort the child when they're scared, but the child can feel free and play and explore the environment, and the child prefers the parent over a stranger. So somebody who exhibits that secure attachment style is basically a happy child, well cared for, comforted, and feels safe enough to explore and not threatened by other people. There's an attachment style called avoidant attachment style, where the child does not seek comfort or contact and shows little interest for the parents versus strangers. Ambivalent attachment style is a child who is very wary of strangers and very distressed when the person leaves and is not comforted at all when the parents come back. And a disorganized attachment style is where the child is very avoidant and has resistant behavior, doesn't seek comfort when they're scared, and avoids touch or comfort. So how this was assessed was she did an experiment called a strange situation, where she had a child playing in a room with their parent. A stranger walks in and starts to play with the child as well, and the mother leaves. And then after a short while, the mother returns. And by looking at the actions of the child when the stranger was in the room and when the mom left and when the mom returns, she managed to identify these different attachment styles. So with a secure child, the child plays happily. And when the mom leaves, the child is not happy. And the child, when the mom comes back, the child welcomes her and returns to playing. So that's a secure child in that particular situation. If you've got a child who's got an insecure or an avoidant attachment style, the child plays happily when the mother's there. When the mom leaves, the child continues to play. And when the mom comes back, the child ignores the mom. So about 10 to 20% of children exhibit an insecure attachment style. An ambivalent attachment style is basically when the mom is in the room, the child is very clingy and very preoccupied with the mother. If the mom leaves the room, the child's very unhappy and will even stop playing. And when the mom returns, the child is angry that the mother left, may cry, hit, or cling to the mother. And a disorganized child or a disorganized attachment style is a child who's very cautious and when the mom leaves, may look very confused or scared, and when the mom comes back, acts very oddly, screams, hits themselves and throw things. So what Mary Ainsworth did was she identified these different qualities of attachment and she named them as these particular styles. So I hope that's clear. And there's a lot of research. There's also videos you can watch in order to understand the strange situation and these particular attachment styles. So obviously, how a mother behaves is very fundamental in terms of that type of attachment style that arises between mother and infant. But as well, the temperament of a child also has an impact. So remember, if you've got a child who is got a very negative temperament, a bad temperament, as a mother, you feel more challenged, and the care and the stress you experience may prevent you from creating a quality attachment with your child. So temperament can impact very much on that type of attachment and the maternal behavior. And I think sometimes when we look back as mothers and we look at how we could have raised our children better, developing that child with a secure attachment in the early years is a very important part of their psychological development, because it also teaches us by becoming parents who are sensitive and responsive. We show the children that the world is a predictable place and that they're able to explore and they can be social and they shouldn't fear much. But if we're insensitive parents and sort of unresponsive to our children, we actually find our children don't venture far and will usually demand a lot of attention. So it does have an impact on future development. It has an impact on children's future relationships with other people, which is important. Sorry, what if the child is used to being around many people, so they show the same signs, insecure when attached, misunderstood, or is it? When there are multiple people around, it can have a different impact on the child. You know, if you have multiple people around, but they're all having sort of responsive and sensitive caregiving towards the child, then the attachment style might be with more than one person. So I think it might be a case. It might be understood. I think in each situation it needs to be looked at and to look at the different relationships the child has with different people and the quality of the individual attachments in that group, if that makes sense. And again, cultural variations can happen that can undermine attachments. Right, so I'm just going to, this is just a little flow diagram, which is in the recording, which you can go and look at, and it just shows how children and different attachments, how the system can work of attachments, but I don't want to use up too much of your time doing that. Children develop language, they learn to communicate. There's one theorist called Chomsky who believes that there's a sort of section of the brain called a language acquisition device, and basically language can just occur with very little influence from the external environment. But what we do learn about language is that regardless of the environment, a little bit like physical development, language development occurs at roughly the same pace. Okay, so when we look at the developmental milestones, like we had physical development, we also have language development, which so in 3 months, the child is cooing and gurgling. By 6 months, they're babbling. By 12 months, they're saying the first words, give or take, within a time frame. So it does happen at the same place. Therefore, there is an element of biological maturation more than personal experience. But parents who are responsive at attempts to communicate with their children do foster rapid early language development. And I think that's important. So language does tend to develop almost in a biological way or an innate way, but the environment does have an impact on language and communication development. So the stages of which language development takes place is initially the children will babble or coo, starting to make the sound structures in their mouth, but they make it in their native language because that's the language that is spoken by parents and within their environment. So they start to use words more frequently, and they use words that are easy to produce. And as they get older, towards about 18 months, they start to have a much bigger vocab, and even a vocab spurt at 18 months. And that shows why it's important to build vocabulary, especially in preschool years, because that's where there's a big learning that takes place in terms of language usage. So therefore, language development in preschool years is important to foster as part of our early learning for development. And then the next phase is they start to combine words together to start to make sentences. And we know that children often leave out non-essential words, but they do start to express themselves with slightly more complex ideas. So a child might say television on, might leave out words in between, dog there, or something. So they're starting to put words together into sentences. But whatever words are produced really are supported by the environment in which they're raised, their native language, their home language, things that they're exposed to in terms of language. So the environment does have an impact on the process of language development, even though it is driven from a biological perspective. Okay, right. Now we move on to one or two theorists who are predominant. If you're in education at all, the names of these theorists might be familiar to you, but we now talk about how personality develops in children, and we talk about how cognitive development happens in children, which are important parts of childhood development. So Erik Erikson, and we see Erik Erikson's theory going through our different lifespans, because his theory actually goes right across the lifespans. So his theory is basically, it's what's called a stage theory. He's talking to personality. And by the stage theory, it means that it's a theory that moves between one stage. When that stage is finished, the next stage happens, and then the next stage happens. So it's moving through the stages. And so again, his theory assumes that individuals must progress through specified stages in order because each stage builds on the previous one. That's what a stage theory means. Okay. They also assume that stages are strongly related to age, and that development is marked by major discontinuities that bring about dramatic change in behavior. So what Erikson did was Erikson theorized that throughout the lifespan, there's 8 stages, starting from early childhood, starting from sort of birth and moving through until adulthood. And what he says is that in each stage, and we'll look at that on the next slide, is that there's a crisis during each stage. So for example, in infancy, there's a crisis between what he calls trusting and mistrusting. And that crisis has to be resolved. And it's the outcome of that resolution, whether someone learns to trust or to mistrust, which determines their personality development going on. So each stage is that psychosocial crisis, and the way the person deals with the crisis shapes the personality that involves transitions in important social relationships. So each stage is represented by 2 agonistic tendencies. That's almost like 2 opposite tendencies or 2 alternative traits, which are the outcomes for each stage, which are then displayed as personality traits over the remainder of life. Okay, so his is a stage theory, and it's very relevant, and we'll see it applied consistently through these different development periods. So in infancy, like I said to you, infancy he considers 0 to 18 months. There's his 8 stages on the left-hand side. So in infancy, what we're really going to do is we just look at the first 4 stages. So the first stage is basically trust versus mistrust. So for each one, there's very important events that take place. So it's to do with feeding and being comforted. You know, if a child is fed, they're not hungry. If they're comforted, they're answering the question, my world is safe, my world is predictable. Whereas if a child is not fed, if they go hungry, they learn that their world isn't safe. They develop mistrust. So an outcome of that is that children who have that sense of trust, when caregivers provide reliability, care, and affection, a lack of this will lead to mistrust, and leading to mistrust will lead to certain personality outcomes. When they've moved through that stage, when they get to 2 or 3, they move through these antagonistic tendencies of autonomy, which is starting to be independent, or shame versus doubt. An important thing there is the child starting to be a little bit independent, important events being toilet training or even dressing themselves, and can they learn to do things by themselves? That's what they're starting to learn between 2 to 3. So they develop personal control. So success in that stage leads to feeling of autonomy. Failure leads to feelings of shame and doubt. So that's what Erikson did. He had the stages, and you need to read through them and understand them. And then we will look at them. So his theory, being a stage theory, means it follows a similar course. It's in a fixed order, and it can apply to every child everywhere. Okay, that's what this particular stage theory alludes to. Okay, so that's Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. When we have cognitive development, that is how children develop cognitively, how their patterns of thinking and reasoning, remembering and problem solving all develop. It's all mental activity and changes, and cognition changes like physical and socio-emotional development and language development, it changes as a function of age. So starting with a newborn child, getting older, there are start moving from simpler tasks to more complex tasks. And again, a very important phase of this is your early years, okay, your early childhood years. So our first theorist when it comes to cognitive development is Piaget. He also is a stage theorist, but his stage theories are to do with cognitive development, and a child moves through 4 stages. But his theory is mainly driven by biology. And so children evolve because that is how they are programmed to evolve. There's very little influence from the outside environment. And children don't start out as thinking beings. They basically construct the world through their own activities and through discovery. And the cognitive abilities develop through these regular stages, with the cognitions and the thinking of the child maturing as they use the concepts and they organize the schemas of what is available around them themselves. So it's very much driven by the child, nothing from within the environment, and it's biologically driven. So the stages he moves through is the sensory motor stage, which is from birth to 2, the pre-operational stage from 2 to 7, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage from 12 on upwards. So we just look at his some of his ideas. I'm not going to just hover on that slide now, because it's not important, but this is again slightly more detail on Piaget's stage theory. So if we look at what sensory motor means, it's 0 to 2 years old. So it's where you've got a child. If you look at the picture on the right, the child's on the back, maybe there's a mobile. So they're starting to coordinate senses with motor responses. A little bit curious about the world, reaching out to touch a mobile, feeling it. They're exploring that environment on their own. Language that they use is very much demand-based, that they need something. When they get to the pre-operational stage of 2 to 7, that start where they see the world symbolically. Okay, they can start to express some concepts, they start to develop some imagination and intuition, but they still struggle a little bit with with abstract thoughts. So you can see that Piaget's stage theory, the child moves through these different stages depending on their age range. Okay, so children are therefore knowledge seekers who contribute to their own development, is what he basically says. And again, not without criticism, little interest in individual differences, which is important and can be quite variable. And it's actually more continuous. It actually is not quite a stage like as implied, and also like by not considering the environment, you're actually not considering the cultural variations that can happen within child development. So coming up opposing Piaget is Vygotsky, who's very relevant in education. Now, his is a social cultural theory. So where Piaget said that the child themselves, with that biological drive, is the agent of change, Vygotsky is saying that cognitive development takes place through interactions with others. Okay, mainly who he calls more knowledgeable others. So that's a parent or a teacher. So, and the influence of culture is very important. So if you look, he has what he calls a zone of proximal development, where if you think about it in teaching and learning, a child doesn't know something. And in order to know something, they've got to be scaffolded by somebody else to learn it. So they learn it through, it's like, learning a shape. You don't just put a shape in front of a child and go square. You first put the shape in front of the child, and then you say, look at the edges. How many sides are there? So you're gradually scaffolding towards understanding about a particular shape till they get to a point where they understand and they can work unassisted. So Vygotsky had a very strong emphasis on the environment. He's not a stage theorist, and his theory of learning applies not just from childhood, but right the way through. As long as we're learning in theory, we are relying on others to teach us things until we can do them on our own and become independent learners on a particular thing. Another theorist in this phase, as well, in this stage as well, is Kohlberg, and Kohlberg's stages apply also across a lifespan, okay? And he looked at moral development in children and adolescents, and it's about developing a sense of right or wrong. And he had a stage theory of moral development based on a scenario, basically moral dilemmas is what he calls them. So if you're presented with a moral dilemma, how do you think about it? Really gauges your moral development process. So he was interested in people's reasoning, how people thought about moral dilemmas. And he said that people then progress through a series of 3 levels of moral development, each of which broken down into 2 sub-levels, each stage representing a different way of thinking about right or wrong. So he had a pre-conventional level, a conventional level, and a post-conventional level. The first stage is a punishment orientation, where people learn what is right and wrong, basically by what is being punished. The second stage is around what is being rewarded. So children then are stimulated by rewards rather than punishment. Then you have a next stage in your conventional level where right or wrong is determined by other people's approval or disapproval. So he had these phases of moral development that really take place from childhood right through into adulthood. And the final stage of moral development is really it's that post-conventional level. Not many people get to be that moral. It's somebody like who is completely at the pinnacle of being able to right or wrong is determined by abstract ethical principles that emphasize equity and justice. So not everybody gets there. Most people, when they go through stages of moral development, really end up in about stage 5, where society tells us what's right or wrong. We're guided by some level of rules. Okay, so that is how Kohlberg's theory of moral development works. Okay, and I am just conscious of time. So that's sort of early childhood. That's some of the important theorists that come into childhood development, looking at physical, language, cognitive, personality, and moral development in children. So the next stage of our lifespan that we look at, that is also very significant, is adolescence, which we really take to be from 10 years of age to about 19 years of age. And the most striking areas of adolescence is obviously sexual maturity that happens and brain development. It's about where children or young adults start to become individuals and can start to have sort of self-concept, self-worth, self-esteem. They're starting to set themselves up as individuals. They're able to define themselves. Again, becoming independent, striving for freedom or autonomy, very much impacted on interpersonal and relationship issues. And if we look at Erikson, which is applied to adolescence, the stage that he has in adolescence is that stage of identity versus role confusion. So somebody who might move through an identity crisis, coming out the other side with a clear identity of who they are, or somebody else might come out as very confused, not understanding certain orientations in their lives and having a role confusion, which can lead to personality issues and probably some kind of behavioral dysfunction. And young adolescents, as we know, also engage in risk-taking behaviors. So if we break adolescence down, we've got early adolescence, which is 12 to 14 years old, middle adolescence about 14 to 16, and then your late adolescence, which is 17 to 19 years old. And within each of those phases of adolescence, there are certain things that happen. So early adolescence is where you have your growth spurts. Between 12 to 14, we know children become very conscious of how they look and their appearance, and they might start to ask questions around family values and why things are as they are in a particular home environment. When middle adolescence, 14 to 16, starting to be more independent, looking for goals, obviously sexual behavior starts to intensify, self-esteem is an issue, peer groups are an issue, and they start to define themselves as individuals, but obviously there are still relationships to the family. And late adolescence is that opportunity to greater definition of self. So the important components in adolescence, and this is where when we have behavioral issues in adolescence or things like that, we start to look at these components to see where issues might arise. Issues around self-esteem, which is their self-worth. Do you have young adolescents have a healthy self-esteem or a poor self-esteem? How do they perceive themselves? We have to look at their moral development. What are their values and beliefs about codes of behavior, which is often linked to everything around them, the family, the social context they find themselves in. We look at their socializing processes. Are they accepted in relationships? Do they have good thinking skills that help them become part of groups with healthy people? Are they mature thinkers? And their self-esteem grows significantly in this process. So if people are not socializing in healthy relationships or have poor cognitive skills, they could very well suffer from low self-esteem, which can cause problems. And they start to also being able to separate yourself from your parents and starting to belong to peer groups is also very important of socializing. And again, an important component of adolescence is you still got cognitive development. So we start to think more intellectually. We have an ability to self-regulate ourselves, to control ourselves. We have the ability to reflect on our thinking and behavior, and we start to develop powerful belief systems. And the final important component is obviously your physical development, which goes through quite extensive processes in young adults, which I'm not going into there, but it's all very well written up in your book, and you know about it. So, adolescence is an important stage in ensuring somebody's well-being as they move into adulthood. So when we look at, as I mentioned to you, is Erikson's psychosocial stages, there's that stage of identity and role confusion. So identity is a consistent, unified sense of self. That's what an adolescent is trying to achieve. They're trying to find that out about themselves. Identity can mean something about a cultural identity, an ethnic identity, a physical identity, all of those issues that young adolescents grapple with, finding their political identity, a relationship identity. So they need to explore those things in this particular phase and come out with a clear idea of who they are. Because if they can't do that, then they start to develop role confusion. Okay. And then we move into adulthood. So that's moving out of adolescence and into that wide, long period of adulthood. And then basically personality is relatively stable. Okay. It can change, but generally it stays pretty stable as you are related to other people. We all develop in the same way. So some things stay constant, some things do change. Some things don't change too much over time, but things like certain trends can increase or decrease or decline with age. So you might find older people start to be less agreeable. Old people start to be less conscientious. Younger adolescents or adults might be more open to new ideas. When you get older, you're not as open to new ideas. So there is some change within those personality characteristics, but generally our personality is stable over time. So if we go back to Erikson again, and he has other stages in his psychosocial development for adulthood. And so those stages, it speaks to intimacy versus isolation. So are we able to develop intimate relationships with others? If we can do that, it leads to empathy, somebody who's empathetic and open. If we can't do that, we end up being isolated. And obviously, there's consequences to isolation. So that's his stage. Once we move into that expansive adulthood, the first thing we do is we look for partners, we find people to settle down with, we have relationships with people until we find the right person. We're developing those intimate relationships. We then move through a later stage where it's sort of generativity versus self-absorption. So we can produce an income for ourselves, we can survive, we're concerned about the future of the population, that our life is meaningful, we're contributing to society, and so we sort of, it's generativity. Otherwise, you get people who are self-absorbed. Their lives are empty and they don't see any progress. They're permanently negative. Life is terrible. The world is terrible. My friends are terrible. I'm not earning any money. So we have to get to a point where we are able to look after ourselves, provide for our well-being, see the world as a better place, and be able to contribute to it as being a better place. And as we get into our older age, we have integrity versus despair. So we don't we have a tendency not to dwell on the mistakes of the past, or look at our imminent death. We've lived our life with integrity, we're good people, or otherwise you get someone who's just despairing and can't find any meaning in life or any satisfaction. So you can see how those stages of psychosocial development work throughout the lifespan, as Erikson has given them to us. Okay, and the final stage is that aging stage. Old age, where all sorts of things happen. Um, we lose our hair, we have hair issues, we lose our hair, our body fat increases, our muscle tone decreases, our motor performance slows down. We have an impact with all of that happening. We have an impact on our self-concept. We don't feel as good about ourselves because we're getting older, we can't see, and our hair is falling out. We have changes in vision and hearing, changes in hormonal functioning, such as menopause. Um, Often they're neural changes in the brain. Our brain tissue declines, the brain weight declines. There's a shrinkage in our active neurons. People need to work hard to keep those brain neurons functioning. Older people should be doing crossword puzzles and kind of keep those neurons firing. Otherwise, they will decrease and shrink. Diseases such as dementia, which is cognitive deficits that include memory impairment. Um, and the probability of those diseases increase with age. Alzheimer's disease as well. So there's significant biological and neural changes that take place with aging, and it's elderly people coming to terms in a way that they can cope with these changes and continue to try to lead healthy, well-balanced lives for as long as they can. And the minute you have that, you also got the psychosocial aspects of aging. So it's about death and dying. It's linked to getting older. But we know that life expectancy has increased. People are dying later in life. But in South Africa, we have that added burden that we have one of the highest rates of adult mortality in the world because of basically poverty, poor health, poor healthcare facilities. So there are those psychosocial aspects that link to aging, about the society we live in and what impact that is going to have on our aging process and ultimately when we die. And the final part of the life cycle is being able to cope with grief, being able to cope with bereavement, where we lose something or someone. And grief is a reaction that people have when there is a bereavement. It's sort of an emotional pouring of loss and when that happens, so there's 5 stages of grief. The stages they talk about is the first one being denial that someone's died, anger that someone has died, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And it's usually non-linear. It can happen, any of those stages can happen at any time, but generally the 5 things are seen in somebody who is experiencing grief. And grief also has physical manifestations as well as psychological, can impact on our cognition, and cultural and personal factors can impact on how grief is experienced. So that's the last slide, guys, and I think my time is up. But I hope that sort of gave you an idea. It's a massive, human development is enormous from all aspects of it, physical and psychological. But I hope I gave you an idea of how it's mapped out. I think a lot of your focus especially needs to be in those early years where development is important, but also be able to understand. I've seen questions in the past where questions been asked about Kohlberg's theory of moral development, and it said, which stage are you in and why? So where do you see yourselves in that sequence and why do you see yourself there? So being able to interpret some of these theories, especially Erickson, especially possibly Kohlberg, in your own circumstances. We've seen they like to look at personal applications of things. So it's important just to understand and think about it in your own contexts as well. So I hope that helps. If there's any questions, you should all be good. I will upload the recording. Are you all good, guys? Thumbs up. Hello. All Thank you. God, I thought maybe something had gone wrong and I'd been speaking to myself for the last half an hour, so that's cool. I'm just going to stop